It's my great honor to invite now 5 very cherished members of our community to come and speak about a passage in the Torah which may have been their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah portion, or one that they've read several times, perhaps publicly in the synagogue, and which speaks to them and has special significance to them. Our first speaker is Professor Peter Lantosh. And Peter, before you come to the bima, I want to, on behalf of all of us here and all participating online, to offer you our congratulations and mazel tov. Your name appears in the Times today as part of the Queen's Honours list, as you've received the British Empire Medal for services to Holocaust education. And of course, there is your wonderful autobiographical book, Parallel Lines, which I hope in mentioning online will reach hundreds of people who, if they haven't read it, will read it, about your time in Bergen-Belsen at the very, very young age of 4 with your mother. So Peter is going to speak about Bereshit, Genesis.
Thank you.
Please remove your mask.
It can be argued that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is the most extraordinary document ever written. It has laid the foundations of 3 monotheistic or Abrahamic religions and established moral and ethical principles which still serve as standard for our civilization. But there is another feature of the Torah which should not be overlooked. The writer Jonathan Fawkes said that of the 100 best stories ever told, 99 are in what he called the Old Testament, the 100th being Homer's Iliad. Of the 5 books, it is the first, Bereshit, which is perhaps the grandest and most picturesque, telling the story of the beginning of our world and our life. For this reason, I was delighted to be able to choose the first parashat for my bar mitzvah reading. This I had 57 years late, at the age of 70, for in 1952, in Hungary, during the darkest years of Stalinist communism, it was practically impossible to have a bar mitzvah. Bereshit is a majestic story dealing with our origin, the creation of our world, with all its inhabitants, plants, animals, and human beings. God created the sun, the moon, and the stars, and with them time and space, and separated darkness from light. Whilst it is the most studied book perhaps ever written, it remains an enigma, being endlessly analyzed and interpreted. Being a medical doctor, I also had training and experience in research. And for this reason, it was great interest to compare the mythology of the Torah with scientific facts. I read exactly the same parashat as Rabbi Igor. Our solar system is a small part of the universe, and it certainly was not created in 5,781 years. The Big Bang occurred in 13.7 billion years ago, and life in the form of primitive organisms were formed 3.8 billion years ago. The rest of the story is a long evolution, a natural selection to Homo sapiens. According to Yuval Harari, the Israeli philosopher, the cognitive revolution, the process which made us what we are, started 70,000 years ago. The fundamental question always has been, and it remains, it is this: does all the scientific evidence invalidate Bereshit? The atheist, of course, would say, yes, it does. However, the authors of Bereshit, whoever they were, could not foresee what we know now. The basic tenet remains that God created us in God's image. We all try to reflect this image, even if it remains an imperfect mosaic. This, like the Torah, is indestructible and will survive us.
Thank you so much, Peter. Our second contributor is Max Lobel. You'll hear a pre-recorded video which he made about his bar mitzvah parashah, Shemot, the very first parashah of the book of Exodus. Max has been a member of this synagogue his whole life. He sings in both our choirs. He's a graduate of the Royal Academy of Music, and he is in the process of becoming a lawyer.
The portion I read for my mitzvah nearly 12 years ago was the second chapter of Exodus, Parashat Shemot, the parashat in which Moses was born. Moses is placed in a reed basket that floats down the Nile until he is eventually picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Within a matter of verses, Moses has grown up and has fled to Midian after striking an Egyptian. It is there that he meets his wife, Zipporah. This story marks the beginning of probably the most well-known story in the Torah, the Exodus from Egypt. For me, in the chapter, there's probably not one single verse that has impacted upon my life, but rather themes in the passage that I think are relevant to all of us still today. Moses' mother was obviously taking a massive risk when she placed her baby in the basket. I think this shows that risks are sometimes worth taking, and in fact even rewarded often. She puts her trust in God that Moses will survive, and this trust has been repaid to her. The second theme reflects the importance of standing up for what is right. On two separate occasions, Moses questions the actions of others. Firstly, when he sees the Egyptians striking the Hebrews, and secondly, when in Midian, shepherds drive away the daughters of the Midianite priest. And so, yes, I think for me that reiterated the importance of being brave, and that we should always be standing up to those that mistreat others.
Thank you to Max. Our third contributor is Dalia Gelfer, who's here with us in the sanctuary. Dalia, whenever I read Bahar B'chukotai, the final portions of Leviticus, I always think of you. I always think about the way in which you thoughtfully interpreted your bat mitzvah portion. Dalia is an assistant at our religion school, Rimon, and also has been a member here for, I think, nearly your whole life, if not your whole life. Over to you.
Thank you. Leviticus, the book of law illustrating the word of God spoken to Moses at Mount Sinai, teaches Jews the way in which we should live our lives. My portion, Bahar of Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 to 12, is a specific example of the law that can be found in this book of Torah. It brings the idea of a day of rest every week, Shabbat, to a larger scale, calling for a Sabbath year, known as a Jubilee year, for the land, where the land too is allowed a rest every 7 years. This called for the Israelites to have a huge amount of trust in God. As for this Sabbath year, they would have to rely on the harvests of the past 6 years to provide food for themselves. They also had to hope and believe that the next year would bring an even fuller harvest than the last. This process is known as leaving the land fallow, the definition being farmland ploughed and harrowed but left for a period without being sown in order to restore its fertility. I draw a parallel between this farming procedure that the Israelites were forced to undergo and our lives this year, as we've had to spend so much more time at home, not necessarily resting, but nevertheless confronted with thinking about our lives, our past and our futures. Sometimes unable to do things we would have liked and forced to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. This time has definitely been a testing one, as we've had to hope, believe, and try to trust in God that the new year will bring better and brighter times. These verses also reminded me of the importance of allowing ourselves to rest and being self-compassionate. Especially now, we must remember to allow for relaxation and appreciation for our work and all we have accomplished. This is what rejuvenates us.
Thank you so much, Dalia. I always think when I listen to some of our younger members speak about the Torah in such astute, sensitive ways and drawing out those lessons, that we have some perhaps future rabbis among us. It's just a little seed, Dalia. Don't get too worried, but you never know, little seeds can grow into big trees. Fourthly, we have with us, William Carver is going to speak about a particular parasha in the book of Numbers. William has spent time studying at Leo Beck College and is a faithful member of my Hebrew class and a very good member, if I can say, certainly knows his grammar. So let me invite you to the bimah, William.
Thank you very much indeed. I actually had an adult bar mitzvah here about 18 years ago, but I can't remember what the passage was. This particular one that comes from Numbers 13 to 14, chapter 13 to 14, I read at another synagogue on another occasion, and it struck me very much at that time. I feel that it illustrates some of the problems that we're facing today, and also it has made a personal impression because it deals with taking risks, which is something that Max was talking about earlier. It's interesting that we seem to have at least two. God probably took a risk in actually creating as well. So this perhaps is number three. In this passage, Moses sends the spies, as they're called, to go and scout out Israel from the Negev as far as the north to establish the scale of the opposition. The spies find grapes, and they report that the land flows with milk and honey, all very attractive so far. However, they also report that the land is fortified, that the cities there are very strong, and that the people who inhabit the country are powerful. Caleb encourages the people to take possession of the land, but his companions redouble their effort to hold them back, and they state, we can't attack that people because they're stronger than we, and that the country we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. And the people we saw are people of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, and if you'd lived at that time, Nephilim would have filled you with absolute horror. They were giants, and we looked like grasshoppers, and so we must have looked to them. So having heard all this, the people are absolutely scared witless. They want to turn tail and go back, and only Joshua and Caleb support Moses and Aaron in their desire to take possession of the land. And this leads to 40 years wandering in the wilderness. The fear of the spies infects the whole people, and what starts as a rational explanation of what they'd found moves into the realm of fantasy and fear. This passage is important to me because I've been several occasions in my life where I found making steps into the unknown difficult. Quite often, it's only by taking a path forwards that you can actually find a way forward. And if you don't do anything, you do nothing. And here the Jews prefer to do nothing and spend 40 years wandering aimlessly, which is probably much worse than what they'd have found if they'd actually gripped the situation and gone in. I feel that there are parallels with our situation today. We pride ourselves on being rational, but in fact we can be taken over by emotion. The fear of COVID-19 can take us over and make us cower in our homes, unwilling to make anything other than personal survival a priority. The result is that we fail in our duty to our fellow men and women to care for the less fortunate, to visit the elderly, to teach our children, support the mentally and physically sick, to help those whose businesses are collapsing. The passage shows that lives can be ruined through lack of courage. Is that what we wish for ourselves?
Thank you so much, William, and thank you to you for coming all the way up from Winchester to be with us today and be part of our in-person congregation. And our final speaker is Christine Stevenson, a very loyal member to this community, and she's going to speak about a passage which she read for her bat mitzvah not so long ago in Deuteronomy. So Christine is joining us via Zoom.
I hope so. I'm here.
Wonderful.
Hello.
We can hear you.
I shall be speaking about Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 18, which were my bat mitzvah parashah in 2018, and contain the 10 Commandments. Their message has not been improved upon. It's a shame that although we all know the 10 Commandments, few are able to name all 10. Nevertheless, such is their power that we all know what they represent, which comes down to keep the laws and be a decent human being. And the wonder is that although they came into being around 2,500 years ago, given to a tribe of enlightened nomads in the Middle East, they remain as important and as relevant a guide today. They seem to come in two parts, the religious and the moral. It is unsurprising that the moral commandments are generally the ones that are remembered. They're very short and list murder, adultery, stealing, and bearing false witness. Most people don't commit those sins today. There are numbers 6, 7, 8, and 9. Number 10 is more difficult. You shall not covet. I would say envy. This is a hard one in the face of social media, which seems designed to make people envious or to have unrealistic expectations. The first 5 commandments are the ones that are not generally remembered specifically. They are integral to being Jewish. They are, briefly, monotheism, no images or idols, swearing falsely, perjury, observing the Sabbath day, and honoring your parents. In these uncertain times, the giving of the 10 Commandments might remind us of the many adversities faced and overcome by our ancestors, and how fortunate we are to have Shabbat and the festivals to give structure to our disrupted lives.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you to all our speakers today for whizzing us through the Torah from beginning almost to the very, very end. Because for those of you perhaps who haven't celebrated Simchat Torah with us, one of the things that we usually do at the very, very end of this service is to unwind the whole of this scroll and have a look at what it looks like. It's visual poetry and it's visual image upon us. And then we wind it all the way back to the beginning so that we can begin again next week, once again, with the reading of Bereshit.